Golems stalk the exiled lands, new prisoners set out on their first journeys, and Kurak screams to the dark gods in his lair. With the Chapter 3 update marking the end of the Age of Sorcery, how does the swan song of Conan's first age shape up? Today I'll be reviewing the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3 update, as I've done and plan to do again in the future for all major updates. So without further ado, let's get started. The Chapter 3 update ships with 4 main features: the new Kurak's Lair dungeon, blood crystals, golem shaping, and the journey revamp. As the final chapter of the Age of Sorcery, I'll be mentioning some story aspects throughout this video, and I already have full lore videos on those story elements which you'll find in the description and in the cards in the top right. I also have full guides on all the new major additions I'll mention in this video if you are looking for a more in-depth tutorial. Firstly, the flagship edition, Kurak's Lair. This new dungeon comes alongside a revamp of Mech-Kamos's Spire, which adds new visuals to the area alongside a map-wide beacon and merchants. Kurak's Lair is the final story beat of the Age of Sorcery, and where the battle between Kurak and the Exile takes place. Kurak is attempting to summon a ritual to spell doom for the exiled lands, and Mech has tasked you, the Exile, to stop it. The ritual is signalled by the Eclipse, a new nighttime effect that will last throughout this chapter, which is quite the visual change that definitely makes things feel a bit more sinister. Anyway, to the dungeon. In terms of pacing and layout, this is a pretty fast dungeon, much smaller than the Wine Cellar or the Warmaker's Sanctuary. You enter through the Transitory Stone, navigate a small chamber and some corridors, and finally reach a large arena where the fight takes place, from which you then have to take a shortcut out and back to the Transitory Stone once the fight is complete. In the gameplay sense, the dungeon feels more like an arena setup rather than what most would consider a dungeon. After entering, the fight is broken into 4 phases. You first have to fight off spiders in the darkness to slay the first mini-boss. You then fight animated golems until you can, again, kill the second mini-boss. Thirdly, you navigate through a maze of corpses as zombies attempt to catch you, destroying corrupted pillars. The 4th phase sees a gargantuan dragon emerge into the arena, and you'll have to avoid his claws and fire as you defeat the 3rd and final mini-boss. You then approach the altar, slay a defenceless Kurak, and escape with his severed head. If you take too long, the ritual completes and an immortal Blood Moon beast spawns, and it's pretty much guaranteed death. This definitely isn't the typical dungeon experience most have come to expect, but I think it holds up well. I do think the enrage mechanic of the Blood Moon beast spawning if you take too long could be better communicated, as I did see some people fairly confused about that. I did also see some bug reports, and at times the spider phase does feel like it goes on longer than intended on my end, but generally I've had a fairly smooth experience with the dungeon. Overall, I really like Kurak's Lair. It's short, sweet, and a decent challenge that doesn't overstay its welcome. It's packed full of lore, and as the sun grows closer to the full eclipse in the background, the setting is undeniably epic. Whilst maybe not quite what people were expecting, Kurak's Lair has turned out pretty good. Blood crystals are another new addition, and it seems to be the current active encounter in Chapter 3, or at least that's how I've interpreted it. Blood crystals are the resource Mech-Kamos's says he needs for his ritual, and when you acquire them, you can spend them with the merchants around Mech's Spire to acquire Magi caches and golem parts. You'll also need to spend 30 crystals every time you want to enter Kurak's Lair. The main intended method of getting blood crystals is to hunt down underground remains which take the shape of rock noses or golems that, when slain, you can harvest for blood crystals. I found this method pretty arduous as the spawns are sparse and you get no real indication of where they can and can't spawn. The preferred method for farming blood crystals is to basically speedrun through Kurak's Lair to make sure you can kill all the golems and harvest them for their copious amounts of blood crystal. This makes farming golem parts on Siptar a bit more difficult, as you can't access Kurak's Lair on that map. I understand the reasoning of why, and I'm not sure if blood crystals are in the loot pool of the vaults on Siptar, as I haven't seen anybody be able to confirm that. Blood crystals are a pretty cool idea, and when you can farm them from Kurak's Lair, they're pretty easy and fun to get. However, the method of searching for the underground deposits is painful, and I've not heard of any alternative method for Siptar, which does make acquiring those crystalline pieces from Master Carver Huang a bit more difficult. Overall, blood crystals are alright, but they're definitely a pain to get if you don't have access to Kurak's Lair. Again, good idea, but they can be a bit frustrating at times. Golems are probably the second biggest addition with this update. You can now craft companions that can not only follow and fight for you, but they can also passively harvest resources. This is something people have wanted for ages, so the excitement around this feature was pretty prevalent. Overall, Golems haven't been an entire disappointment, but they haven't really revolutionised the game either, at least not from my perspective. Golems are functionally a little different from regular thralls. Whilst they're technically easier to get on the lower end as you can craft the pieces, they can't be healed, though they do have damage deflection mechanics. That makes them a bit of a strange choice for PvE, as whilst they can be effective, it does sometimes feel like a waste, though I suppose they are a good disposable damage source for the cheaper golems. I have also heard people say that well-perked crystalline golems do last quite a long time as well. In terms of passive gathering, they only do this when they're following you, though in the future they and thralls will be able to do this autonomously. They're not the best at gathering, but they're not designed to be. They can seek out specific resources and generally do an alright job of supplementing your own harvesting capabilities. Last I tested, there were a few glitches, like the mining golems being attracted to resources beneath the map mesh, and some of the other golems struggled to hit enemies below them like salamanders and crocodiles. Generally speaking though, as long as you keep an eye on them, which you'd be doing if they were following you anyway, harvesting golems are a decent way to augment your own harvesting capacity. All things considered, golems are a decent addition that haven't changed the landscape of Conan Exiles, but they do kind of fill a niche. They're able to help you with gathering, and unlike combat thralls, they are craftable and therefore renewable without having to find, knock out, drag back and break a human thrall. In my opinion, they're in a okay spot, but I think with autonomous harvesting and some improvements to their capabilities and mechanics, golems could become even better in the future. Another new feature is the Journey Revamp. Conan Exiles' journey system really showed its age, and being a mostly text-based system that focused just as much on lore as it did on actual gameplay, it wasn't particularly engaging for experienced players and, at times, a bit unwieldy for new players. The new journey system attempts to rectify that by adding tutorial-esque mini-quests that teach important skills and offer valuable rewards. This system covers everything from taking your first steps to summoning gods and pretty much everything else in between. The journey system is map specific and offers consumable items, placeables and crafting recipes. I've said before, I'm not really the target demographic for this system, it's probably more geared at new and returning players. However, I do think the system is quite good. Some people have found it a bit confusing, especially being that you have to manually track a journey to progress it, and I do think that is a slight downside. There were also issues initially regarding previously completed steps not registering properly, but I do believe they were rectified with a hotfix. I do, overall, think the Journey Revamp is actually really good for the game. It adds new armours, new crafting recipes, and helps to diversify the rewards already available in the game in terms of gear. From my experience, it was also decent in balancing handholding and player-driven exploration to help new players learn effectively. There were some issues I had in that the information provided wasn't as clear as it could be, and a couple of the rewards were a bit underwhelming, but overall, I think the Journey Revamp was actually a really good thing for the game, and aside from a few complaints, it's executed quite well. Now, the Battle Pass. I'm going to go ahead and say this is probably the best Battle Pass we've had so far. There's still the presence of less desirable rewards like the potion flasks, which, I'll be honest, I just don't want to see them in the Battle Pass anymore, but I think in general, the rest of the rewards are pretty good. There's a decent balance of placeables, wall and floor decals, weapons, armours, emotes and skins. Of course, you get your 1200 Crom coins back for buying the pass still, and whilst the previous passes were, in my opinion, very strict in their scope for sorcery, this set branches out a bit more, and it feels like it's not afraid to have a bit of fun and offer interesting items that don't always fit with the super serious and dark themes of the Age of Sorcery. All things considered, pretty good Battle Pass, probably my favourite so far. Decent rewards across the board, and if the Battle Passes continue to improve in this fashion, I'd be quite happy. I just want to get the spell flasks and similar consumables out of there. And now, the Black Lotus Bazaar. There's a lot of smaller things added this time around, but the standout bundles with this chapter's Bazaar are the Remnants of Set, Arcanists of Zar, Aquilonian Secret Passages, and of course the Turanian Building Set extension. Rather than picking through them all meticulously, I'm going to try and cover them all, as I believe the complaints I have are pretty much the same across the board. I've said before, the quality of the designs of almost everything in the Bazaar is great. Even compared to more recent DLCs like Numidian, which is one of my favourites, The quality is, in my opinion, much better in the Bazaar. However, the ultimate question I ask myself of every bundle is this: is it worth the price? The answer for most of them is no. I think the only one I've really recommended so far is the Stormglass Cathedral set from Chapter 2. I'll give a little bit of leeway there, as I haven't fully reviewed the Terranian expansion set at the time of recording, mainly because it's bugged, but I'll touch on that again in a moment. I love the designs of, honestly, almost everything in the Bazaar, and I'd love to be able to recommend most of it to you, because I do want Conan to succeed and do well financially. However, as many have pointed out, the prices are, across the board, still too high. There are maybe one or two exceptions, but it's still the general sweeping issue with the Bazaar. I know, I harp on this point in every review, but it's important to keep saying, even if it's just so I can reference my take on pricing in the future when these prices do hopefully drop. Some of these bundles could be cut at a third or even a half for some of them and be a much more attractive price point. Also, back to the Terranian expansion set, that bundle was pretty bugged when it came out. It wasn't impossible to use, but it was extremely difficult. With premium items like this, that just can't happen. I know things go awry in game development, it's rarely as easy as changing a value and it's fixed, but the issue of QA is one that has consistently plagued Conan Exiles. People can forgive smaller bugs, but when you have big issues with premium items, purchased with real-world currency, it's a recipe for disaster, and this shouldn't happen again in the future. If it were to arise again where a set was bugged in this way that so critically affects the way it's used, I know I'd much prefer to read a tweet from Conan that says, hey, this won't be on the Bazaar for a bit because it's bugged, rather than get it in-game and find out for myself. Overall, same verdict as before. The new Bazaar editions are aesthetically beautiful, fit the world nicely, and are really well designed, but the pricing just stops me from fully recommending 99% of the content here. So, all things considered, where does the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3 fall? Much like the Chapter 1 review, we're in kind of uncharted waters here, as we're at the end of the first age. The story has been wrapped up pretty well, aside from a few things that I think will play into future ages. Lore-wise, this is the most invested I've been in a Conan story for a long time. It feels like there's been a ton of passion poured into this story, and I have really enjoyed it, not just because I get to make lore content, but for my own enjoyment too. This has been probably one of my favourite stories of Conan Exiles to date, possibly even rivaling my favourite, The Kinscourge. In terms of gameplay and new additions, it's generally positive with some detriments. Let's be honest, we're never going to get a perfect 10 out of 10 update, they don't really exist, but I do think the devs have been ambitious with the features included. There are some issues and frustrations, but in terms of gameplay, I'm left with a fairly positive impression overall. On the microtransaction front, the Battle Pass is pretty solid, much better than the Chapter 2 Battle Pass, and better than the Chapter 1, which I also quite enjoyed, but the Bazaar still suffers from the issue of overpricing along with some QA concerns. I mentioned in my Chapter 1 review that it'd be interesting to see how the age system plays with regularity. Conan suffered for ages, no pun intended, from irregular updates. Sometimes months would pass without hearing a word from Funcom. That has been a marked improvement with this new system. We know when to expect things, and Funcom have been more active on their social media channels, especially in the run-up to those updates, giving us something to chew on whilst we wait for the reveal. I'm really happy to see the Aegis system has added that much needed regularity to Conan, and compared to the Siptar Drought that you've probably heard me mention before, it is an absolute night and day difference. So, what's my rating for the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3? I've debated this rating for a while, and all things considered, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. It's not perfect, we're still a fair distance from that, but I think the Age of Sorcery Chapter 3 is a very ambitious update that feels like it was trying to give the community what they wanted with a sprinkle of what they needed to. The execution wasn't perfect, and there are definitely some downsides. However, considering all the new things added, the hype leading into the update, the reveal, and the features added and the conclusion of the story, I really enjoyed this update. The story of the Age of Sorcery has been wrapped up nicely with just a little string to tug on for the next age, and it's left me really excited to see what comes in June this year when we see the beginning of the next age, and of course I'll be covering all the news of that, including a full review like this when that age begins. Thanks for watching. As always, please do let me know your opinions in the comments below. I always seem to end up a bit of an optimist when it comes to reviews, and I'll admit I'm probably a little bit biased due to how invested I was in the story, so I imagine there will be many people out there with different takes on this chapter, but this review is just basically how I see it. As always, a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.